All right, we're ready to go with our study in Deuteronomy. This is a video that's being produced for our members of the El Bethel Church in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Though others will tune in, this is for the purpose of keeping us caught up while we're out of pocket on our classes during the coronavirus. We're ready for Deuteronomy chapters 31 and 32, so we'll get underway looking at those. I remind you as we're putting the slides up for our study for today, that this is a quick summary. If you haven't joined us before for these studies, this is a quick summary, as all of our studies in John and Deuteronomy are right now. Just a quick 25 minute overview of these chapters, getting the gist, getting the outline of the chapter. That's primarily what we're focusing on, and that's what we're doing. So we're looking at Deuteronomy chapters 31 and 32. Those are the passages that are slated for April the 15th, this Wednesday night, and therein is our study. This is an outline by Warren Wiersbe that we have been following. We're ready for the fourth of these sections. We've looked at the historical concerns, practical concerns, prophetical concerns, and here are the personal concerns as Moses looks up, starting with chapter 31. This is his last and farewell address. We have two things we're going to consider, chapters 31 and 32, a new leader and a new song. And then next time we'll look at chapters 33 and 34. If you will, pause the video and read chapter 31. And then on the other side of that, we will give consideration to the chapter. All right, we're ready for chapter 31. Here are four things that are found in chapter 31. Chapter 31 of Deuteronomy deals with Moses' farewell. He makes 3 points here, verses 1 to 8. He says, do not be afraid. Secondly, verses 9 to 13, the law was to be read every 7 years. And then we have in 14 to 30, a new leader, a warning, and a song. So let's look at verses 1 to 8. The point here is that Moses encourages the people to not be afraid because God would be with them. Look at verses 1 and 2. Moses says that he will not be able to cross over the Jordan, but they will be going over. Moses says at verse 2 that I'm 120 years old today and no longer go out and come in. It's not a reference to his age. That is, he's getting old. He is aging. But we'll see in chapter 34 and verse 7 that even though he was aging, his eyes had not grown dim, nor his natural vigor abated. So this is not a reference that he's unable to continue to operate and continue to function and to move, but we're going to see later in the context why God would not allow him to enter. He said, you shall not, the Lord had told him, you shall not cross over this Jordan. So Moses is saying, you're going over, but I'm not going to go over with you because God told me I wouldn't go over. Now, beginning at verse 3 through verse 6, the Lord will go with you and give you victory. The Lord said at verse 3 that the Lord, through Moses, that the Lord is going to go over and destroy the nations that are before you, and Joshua himself is going to cross over with you. And the Lord's going to do to those nations like he did to Sihon and he had done to Og, those kings and those nations that were on the east side of Jordan, as God had led in victory over them, so God would lead in victory over those on the west side of the Jordan. Verse 5, the Lord may go with you, that you may do according to the commandment that I have given you. Now notice at verse 6, only be strong and of good courage, do not fear nor be afraid. And then he gives the reason for it, because God had said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So I'm not going over because God has forbidden me to go, but you're going over. Joshua is going with you. Be strong and of good courage. God will give you victory. Now at verses 7 and 8, to finish that section, Moses told Joshua not to fear because God would go with him. So Moses called Joshua and said to him in sight of Israel, be strong and of good courage, and then gave him the same reason because God had said he will never leave you nor forsake you. So in verses 1 to 8, the point is God has said, do not be afraid. I'm going to go with you. Moses is not going. Joshua is going to lead, but you'll have victory because God had promised he would never leave them nor forsake them. Now in verses 9 to 13, in Moses' farewell, the law was said to be read every 7 years. In verses 9, 10, and 11, we see that he gave the law to the Levites and told them to read it in the year of release. Let's see when that would take place. At verse 9, Moses wrote the law and delivered it to the priests and the Levites who bore the ark, and gave instruction at the end of every 7 years at the appointed time in the year of release at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Well, on the screen before you have the Jewish calendar. It starts here with our January on the outer circle and going around to September, what would be late September for us. That's when the Feast of the Tabernacles would take place, in tantamount to late September for us. And so during that time, he said, at the year of release, at the Feast of the Tabernacle, when Israel comes together, you shall read the law before Israel in their hearing. Now, what's going to take place in the reading of the law? Well, obviously, this is taking place at the Feast of the Tabernacles, but it doesn't mean that they read the law in its entirety, that every single word of the law, I don't think. Nor did it mean that they didn't read the law in its entirety, nor did it mean that the law was not read at other times, but it was to be read every 7 years at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now, the purpose for that, notice at verse 12 and 13, was so that the people might learn to fear and carefully obey. So gather the people together, the men, the women, the little ones, and the strangers, that they may hear and may learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully observe all the words of this law, that your children may know it and may hear and learn to fear God. Now, one of the things we've talked about in the study of Deuteronomy is looking for the term fear as it is directed toward God, and raise the question, what did we learn about fear? Well, here's one of those passages. We learn from this that we can learn to fear God. We don't just automatically fear God, we learn to fear God. Fear can be taught, fear can be learned. And if I'm learning to fear God, I might need to learn more about the fear of God to have a deeper fear and respect for God. But I'm also learning from this text that when one fears God, they will carefully obey the words of the law. That's another concept we've been watching for. So you might underline the word fear here and the word carefully as we learn about carefully observing the words of the law because of the fear of God. So the law was to be read every 7 years that the people might learn to fear and carefully obey. Now we have in 14 through 30 a new leader, a warning, and a song. What we have is that Joshua is going to be the new leader, beginning at verse 14. That the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tabernacle of meeting, and I will inaugurate him. So Moses brought Joshua. Then at verse 15, this is interesting. Here we have God's stamp of approval. That the Lord appeared at the tabernacle in a pillar of cloud, and the pillar of the cloud stopped above the door of the tabernacle. So this miracle gave evidence of God's approval of Joshua's leadership, so that as Moses dies, the people are assured that Joshua is their God-given and divine approved leader. So Joshua is the new leader. Now let's jump ahead to verse 23. He inaugurated Joshua and said, be strong and of good courage. You shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them that I will be with you. So Joshua is the new leader. Now, beginning at verse 16 through 18, we have a warning about departure. The Lord said, I will give you rest. Behold, you will rest with your fathers. That is, this is the Lord speaking to Moses. You're going to rest with your fathers. And this people will rise up and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land, and they shall go among them, and they'll forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. So what Moses is told is these people are going to go across into the land. They're going to get to know the people of the land. They're going to become like the people of the land, and they're going to forsake me, and they're going to serve their gods. Verse 17, my anger shall be aroused against them, and I will forsake them and hide my face, and they'll have evils and troubles, and that will befall them, and they will say things like, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? A charge that our God has forsaken us. It was just the opposite, though. Now, verse 18, I will surely hide my face because of all the evil that they have done, in that they have turned to other gods. So here was the warning. They're going to go into the land. It's going to happen. They're going to depart. There's going to be problems. Now, beginning at verse 19, God said, in 19 through 22, and then we'll see it again at verse 30, that Moses was instructed to write down a song as a witness. That therefore write down a song for yourselves and teach it to the children of Israel and put it in their mouths, and the song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. When I've brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, and they're eaten and have filled themselves and have grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them and provoke me and break my covenant. Now that's exactly what we saw in Deuteronomy 6 in verse 12, that when they got into the land, they would be having land that they didn't deserve, that have houses they didn't build, vineyards they didn't plant, wells they didn't dig, and when they have eaten and are full, they'll forget about their God. Well, he said that's what's going to happen. Now what this song will do is when they have this song and they sing this song, that serves as a witness from their own mouth. A witness from their own mouth concerning what's going to take place. Now look at verse 21, that when they have the evils that come upon them, this song will testify against them as witness, for it will not be forgotten in the mouths of the descendants. And God said, I know their inclinations. And so Moses wrote the song that same day and taught it to the children of Israel. Now drop down to verse 30. I know we're skipping a few verses. We're going to come back. We'll get those verses 24 to 29 in a moment. But verse 30 is still a part of this writing down the song, that Moses spoke in the hearing of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended. And so Moses wrote down the song and presented it to the children of Israel. Now verse 24 to 29 is the only part we haven't covered of chapter 31. The law was to be put beside the ark. So Moses completed the writing of the words of the law, and when they were finished, he gave it to the Levites and said, take, verse 26, the book of the law and put it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and it will be there as a witness against you. Now why? Well, I know your rebellion. Same thing he said at verse 21. I know your rebellion, that you are stiff-necked, and they are rebellious against the Lord. So God said, I know their tendencies, I know their inclinations, and this law will be a witness against them concerning the testimony that indeed they will turn aside from the Lord, and the Lord's anger would be stirred against them. So here's what we saw in chapter 31. I know that that's a quick survey of chapter 31, but this gets the gist of what chapter 31 is about. It's Moses' farewell. He said, don't be afraid. God is going to be with you. I'm not going over. Joshua is going to lead you. But don't be afraid. And remember, God will never leave you nor forsake you. The law is to be read every 7 years. Moses is appointing Joshua, God through Moses is appointing Joshua as a new leader. There's a warning about departure. And then here is a song that serves as a witness. Now we're ready for chapter 32. So pause the video, read chapter 32, and then we'll start with that on the other side. All right, here's what we have in chapter 32. We have the song that we've been reading about in chapter 31. We have the song in verses 1 to 43. Then there's the exhortation to carefully obey the law, 44 to 47. And then Moses is said to die on Mount Nebo. He doesn't die in this chapter, but God tells him that's where he's going to die after he sees the land of Canaan. So let's talk about the song. There are 6 sections to this song. Now the first of those sections, verses 1 to 4, is simply a proclamation of the Lord's greatness, of how great and good and that God has been to his people. He said, give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. Give ear, O earth, and let my words of my mouth, and let the teaching drop as rain, my speech distill as dew, as raindrops on the tender herb, and as showers on the grass. Seems to be talking about as the soft rain softens the ground, may the words of God, like a soft rain, soften the hearts of the people. But it's a reminder, though, that God is great. Ascribe greatness to God. He is our rock. His work is perfect. For all his ways are justice, a God of truth, and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. So God is great. He's upright. He is the great and mighty God. Now, verses 5 and 6. Secondly, in this song, Israel has corrupted themselves. In contrast to the perfect nature of God, Israel verse 5, have corrupted themselves. They are not his children. In other words, they're not behaving like his children. They don't act like his children. Because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation they are. They're foolish and unwise. And so everything in God's nature, God's creation, obeys and submits to God except his people. And that's his point, is that in contrast to his greatness, Israel has corrupted themselves. But now, verses 7 to 14, the Lord has continually blessed his people. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, ask the elders. Ask them about the history of the past, and they'll remind you of how God has richly blessed his people. It's as if God found Israel as an orphan in a desert and provided protection for him and made something out of him. You see, if Israel just understood the greatness of God, they would not turn to idols. One writer said at this juncture of this study of Deuteronomy that no religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. Whatever their idea of God is how great their religion is. And so going down through verse 14 is how God has richly blessed them, and they will be reminded of that. Now let's begin at 15 through 18. In spite of that, we're going back to the point was made in verses 5 and 6, Israel forgot God. So God was great, but Israel corrupted themselves. The Lord richly blessed Israel, but Israel forgot about God. But Jeshurun, verse 15, that's Israel. That title means, or that name means righteousness. We see it used in Isaiah 44 and verse 2. But Jeshurun, or Israel, grew fat and kicked. You grew fat and grew thick. You were covered with fat. Then he forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of salvation and provoked him to jealousy. So what am I learning? That when Israel got into the land and they had it better than they've ever had it before, and they had eaten and they were full, then they forgot about God, just like was warned in chapter 6 and in verse 7. They provoked the Lord to jealousy with foreign gods. They sacrificed to demons, verse 17. Of the rock who begat you, they were unmindful. They forgotten God who fathered them. So they turned their back on God and they turned to idolatry. Now, verses 19 to 33, the Lord says he will punish his people. He's going to punish them for their turning to idols. And so at verse 19, when the Lord saw it, he spurned them. Because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters, I will hide my face. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. They turned aside in a lack of faith. That is, they received the blessings from God. They didn't appreciate the blessings from God, and they turned aside with little or no faith. And so they provoked God to jealousy. And so now, verse 21, they have provoked me to jealousy by what is not God, and I'll be moved to anger by their foolish idols. I'll provoke them to jealousy by those that are not a nation, and I'll be moved to anger by a foolish nation. It's a reference to the Gentiles. Because my people have rejected me, I'm going to turn to the Gentiles. I know that's what he's talking about because this is quoted in Hosea 1, 9 and 10, and then again in Romans 10 and in verse 9, and referring to the time of the Messiah when God would embrace the Gentiles in the kingdom of God. And so God's fire is kindled against them. God's going to punish them. Now, I want you to notice, as we go a little bit further, God said at verse 23, I'll heap disasters upon them. Now, verse 25, that they shall have terror. Verse 26, that I would have dashed them to pieces and made their memory to cease. And yet God said, I feared what the enemy might say about them and about me. And for they are a nation void of counseling. Nor is there any understanding. Verse 28, among them. And oh, that they were wise and would understand and would consider their latter end. Now, verse 30 seems to be talking about captivity. That I will put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them. So in other words, God, in essence, sold them to their enemies by allowing enemy nations like the Assyrians and later the Babylonians to take them into captivity. Now let's get verse 34 to 43, and that's the end of the song. what happens here? Well, God will show compassion and mercy in judgment and vengeance upon their enemies. That is it not laid up in store and sealed up among the treasures? Vengeance is mine, I will recompense. That's at verse 35. The Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants, verse 36. Look at verse 43 to end that song. He said, Rejoice, O Gentiles, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. So God's going to show compassion and mercy and judgment and vengeance on the enemies of God. So here's what I'm learning from this song. God is a great God. Israel provoked God through their corruption. They corrupted themselves. Israel was extremely blessed by God, and yet they still forsook their God. The Lord would punish them, and yet the Lord would deliver them and show compassion and mercy and judgment and vengeance upon his enemies. Now that song, we've already seen, would serve as a witness against them as they're taught this song and would sing this song. That serves as a witness against them when they go into their apostasy. Now let's go further. In verses 44 to 47, we have the exhortation to careful obedience to the law. So at verse 44, Moses came to Joshua and spoke all the words of the song in the hearing of the people. And when Moses had finished these words to all Israel, he said, Set your hearts on the words which I testify against you today. So set your heart on all the words that are found in this song. Now then, verse 46b, the end of that verse, command your children to carefully obey the words of the law. So which I shall command you, your children, to be careful and observe all the words of this law. The thing the song should do is encourage them to be careful in their obedience to the law. Now, we've been watching for this word careful. We noted it back in chapter 31 and in verse 12. Here again in chapter 32 and verse 46, we have that word careful, of careful obedience to the law. Now, verse 47, what this will do will prolong their days when they cross over into Jordan. If they don't carefully observe the law, which they did not, the days would not be prolonged and they would be taken into captivity. Now let's finish chapter 32 by looking at Moses is to die on Mount Nebo. Now to get a picture of where Mount Nebo is here within the circle that you see. There's Mount Nebo near unto Jericho, and that's where they're going to go in and conquer, and then on over to Ai. So this is the region we're talking about when we talk about Mount Nebo. So beginning at verse 48, the Lord spoke to Moses that very day and said, Go up to the mountain, Mount Nebo, and across from Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I have given to the children as a possession, and down the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was gathered to his people. So go up to the mountain, and that's where you're going to die, and you're going to see the land, but you're not going to go over. Now, I said we'd come back to this, so let's look at verse 51. Why was he not allowed to enter? We already know this from Numbers 22, but here he emphasizes it now. Because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. Because you didn't obey my word, therefore I'm not allowing you to enter. Now, that ought to serve as a warning to the children of Israel. As they go over into the land, they think about their leader Moses died on the other side, just as God had said. He was not allowed to enter, just as God said. That ought to serve as a reminder. He didn't come because he disobeyed. We better be obedient. And when God said that if we sin, we're going to go into captivity, they ought to know God meant what he said because he did exactly what he said to Moses and would not allow him to enter. So look at verse 52 to finish. At verse 52, you'll see the land, but you're not going to go. You shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there, in the land which I'm giving to the children of Israel. So this is the song of Moses, the song, and then the exhortation to carefully obey the law, and Moses was to die at Mount Nebo. That's where he would die. Well, that's our study from Deuteronomy chapter 31 and 32, and we'll pick up and finish other things in the book a little bit later on, but that's our study from Deuteronomy chapter 31 and 32.